Thank you so much for inviting me today here for the Francis William Thompson Critical Issues Conference. So I'm here to talk about education in the age of generative AI. This is who I am. This is my contact information. It's my website. Almost everything I do is publicly available on my website. A little bit about me, because I want to frame this in a slightly bigger context. So my undergraduate degree is in engineering. After that, I ended up going to design school, film school, ended up getting my PhD in education. Most of my work has been in educational technology, creativity, teacher education. And, I do a lot of research, I do write, but I always have called myself an educational systems designer, because I think there is education always about making things better, and that's sort of a design perspective that I bring. I'm also a parent and a former school board member when I was in Michigan, in the Oklahoma School Board. So I'm going to take a little bit of a long view, because I think as we think about this technology, we very often get sort of overwhelmed or caught up in the sort of the hype around it, and I want us to think a little longer. I've been in this field a while now. So I grew up in India in this little place called Mizoram. That's me, that's what I look like with hair. The interesting thing there is that when I was growing up at that time, we didn't have electricity. So every evening, we would light these lamps, these lanterns, and that's how cooking was done, everything was done. Your cycle of the day was determined by the rising and the setting of the sun. And so, this was a transformative technology. When we first got electricity, I remember running from room to room, switching on, seeing this magic and thinking, there is a future to this technology, right? And then my father got transferred to Delhi, and I was very interested in a whole variety of things. In India, if you're good at science and math, you either become a doctor or an engineer. So I ended up going to engineering school. And that was in some ways sort of the 4 worst years of my life. I call that the Fourier transformation. Those of you who are into math will get that joke. Otherwise, just ignore it. But the point was, I went in deeply enthusiastic about science, about math, about art and literature. I was writing limericks about relativity when I was in my freshman year, and 4 years, they just beat it out of me. Whatever, right? And so I said, okay, I still love science and math. I still love film and art and so on. What can I do with it? So I said, okay, I'm going to make educational film. I grew up watching Carl Sagan. I grew up watching Jacob Bronowski. I said, fine, that's what I'm going to do. So I ended up at the Industrial Design Center to get my master's degree in making educational film and visual communications. And that's when I came across this guy. And this is literally the guy, because you had floppy disks. This is pre-internet, pre-all of those stuff. But somehow at that moment, when playing with this technology, I realized that something interesting was going to happen at this intersection of the power of representation and interactivity that this technology had with the aesthetics and the ideas of cinema and film and all of, this thing would come together. And this is what I sort of felt like. And this is a photograph of me, again, with hair, as you can see, working on that old Mac. And then many years later, going back and visiting, that actually is a former student of mine who ended up becoming the head of department in the Industrial Design Center. And he actually still kept that Mac with him. So we managed to get a picture. And I wasn't sure where this would go, but I knew that this intersection of education as design was going to be what my career was going to be. That I had found sort of an intellectual home and a community and a history and a tradition that I could fit into. Ended up coming to Urbana-Champaign to get my PhD. This is early 90s that I'm talking about. And when I was in Urbana-Champaign, those of you who know your history would know that back then there was this place called NCSA, National Center for Supercomputing Applications, where the first Mosaic browser was created. And I sort of started playing with the web early on and thinking, this is interesting. But things didn't really sink. Oh, by the way, that's one of my first websites. It's still archived on the internet, Wayback Machine. And what's fun is that it still has a link to my daughter's birth announcement, which I think is kind of cool. But it was, somebody told me about this software called WebStar. Said, oh, you can take your own machine and make it into a server. And I had no real idea what it meant. So one day I'm in the lab, I download the software, I fire it up. It's like, okay, I go to another machine, I type in some random set of numbers, which is an IP address, and a page comes up saying, welcome to WebStar. Okay, so what? Go back, change one. I remember this, I changed one word. Hit save, came back, hit reload, and the page changed. And I remember dropping the F-bomb at that moment, because it hit me that anybody in the world with access to the internet now could see this page, which meant I could be a publisher, I could be an author, that this is the next Gutenberg revolution. And it became clear that that's where I was going to focus the rest of my career. So it was the Mac first, and electricity first, of course, then the Mac happens in my life, and then the web happens. And that's been my career. Got my PhD, ended up at Michigan State University. I was there for 18 years, ran across this man called Matt Taylor. He looks very cool with glasses, without glasses. And it's been the most productive intellectual partnership I've ever had. I owe almost my entire career to this man, and he's a wonderful friend and colleague till today. And together, some of you, those who know my work, would know that Matt and I developed back in 2006, where we formally introduced this thing called the TPAC framework, which is a framework for technology integration in education. But that's a different story. I won't go into that. But I want to come back to this idea of that web star and web publishing, and the thing that the guardrails or the barriers to each one of us becoming creators of content and sharing it with the world. That part, sort of stayed. It's something I want to come back to. And I'm thinking of, when I'm thinking of 2006, 7, 8, social media is first coming out. We had the Arab Spring, and I remember thinking, like, wow, this is amazing. Information is getting democratized. This is awesome. And you can go back and look at my blog posts. I'm writing about thinking about how we could use social media in our teaching and so on and so forth. And I should have been smart, right? And I didn't think of the fact that Facebook and Twitter could get weaponized in ways that they could be used to spread misinformation, that the sort of the business models that would underlie the social media would depend upon engagement and would depend on advertising, and that would push you towards more extreme content, and that the whole thing that we're seeing today with the youth and the mental health crisis that we're facing. And again, I'm not blaming it all on social media, but the evidence is quite strong that does play a very critical role in that. So basically, some circumspection, as the pigeon says, careful, prudent, discreet, cautious, and so on and so forth. 18 years at Michigan State, ended up at Arizona State University. This is a mandatory slide, which says we are #1 in innovation. We care so much about it, we put it on every hoarding and bus. If you're ever in Phoenix, if this doesn't slap you in the face, then ask for your money back. And to be honest, it is an amazing institution. And again, I'm not saying this that it is just because I am there. There are sort of, like any organization, there are pluses and minuses. But to have an organization of that size that works and behaves like a startup is very different. It's very, very different. And many of you might have heard the news of the partnership that ASU has with OpenAI, which was recently announced. But I'm sort of jumping the gun here to go back a little bit to November 2022, when ChatGPT first landed in our world, right? And that was almost, for many people, the first sort of real introduction to AI. But AI has been with us for a long time. I mean, if you've used Alexa and Siri and Google Maps and Photos, Google Photos, so on and so forth, we have all used AI. But something happened. Why did this ChatGPT thing go sort of, when it released, got crazy? And of course, now you have a whole bunch of models out there in the world doing their own funky stuff, which we will come to at some point, I guess. ChatGPT comes out, and the discourse around education becomes like, oh my God, this is the end of education as we know it. The student essay is dead and gone. Which sort of bothered, that whole discussion sort of bothered me at one fundamental level, that if an AI can do the assignment that you're giving your students to do, or if your students are cheating, that's actually on you. When we worry about cheating, I want us to ask us this question: why are students cheating? Is that on them or is that on us? That's a very important question to ask. Of course, the fact that we are here gathered at this meeting means that the discourse around, this has changed somewhat. And I think that's a good thing, because it moves us away from the sort of punitive, ban it, stop it kind of a discourse to a more positive, like what can you do with it, what are the strengths, what are the weaknesses. I do a lot of work in the K-12 space, and that's where I think the most whiplash is being felt, where we did these interviews and focus groups with a whole bunch of superintendents, actually a whole bunch from Michigan as well. And the title of the article that we wrote was called, "Can we please slow it all down?" Because this thing is moving really fast. But I want to spend a little bit of time because I think a lot of the discourse around generative AI misses what it really is. So I want to talk a little bit about what is generative AI, understanding it, and how does it differ from other technologies. So my friend Sean Leahy asked generative AI, what does generative AI look like? And according to generative AI, it's a woman with funky stuff on their head. But actually what Gen AI looks like is this. It's banks and banks of servers which are churning among huge gobs of data. At some level, if you have to have a photograph of it, that's what it is. But as important to realize what Gen AI is not. And I think that was the biggest mistake that happened in the educational discourse right at the beginning. That's why we were worried about plagiarism. That's why we were worried about, it is not a search engine. It is not a truth machine. It is not an oracle. It's only when we recognize that and start thinking about what it is, then we can really take advantage of it. So what is it? First of all, by definition, it is generative, which means anytime you ask it a question, it's going to come up with a different answer ab initio. It's going to make it up from scratch, just like I have never said exactly these set of words in my life before, because I'm going to end this sentence with the word bingo. Never said that before. ChatGPT is that way. It is generative. And some people have called it, it's a stochastic parrot, which is that it's predicting the next word based on probabilities. I have a sort of a quibble about that. I think it's a little more sophisticated than that. I think it is forming broader abstractions, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. Second, it's multimodal. So I have a video on my website, which is entirely generated by AI. The words were created by AI. The voice was trained on 11 labs, and the video was made by some other thing. And there's me giving a lecture. Interesting point, 11 labs changed my accent, made me sound vaguely British, which somebody said makes me sound more credible. However, it also undermines my voice, my identity, things that we need to be thinking about. And finally, Gen AI is dialogic, it's conversation. Again, that's a very important thing to think about for certain implications that will have, that I'll come to later. And it has been an amazing tool for creativity. If you just go on my website, I can't go through example after example of the kinds of things that I have been able to do with it. Having conversations between two dead philosophers, writing poetry in mathematics, about math, about a proof in mathematics, and I asked it to insert an error in the proof. This is what's really, I said, I want you to write a proof inverse of Euclid's proof of the infinity of primes, but I want you to include an error in the proof. And it's amazing, it included an error, which certain math websites make. I have links to those, which means now think about, so this is where I say that it is more than a mere stochastic parrot. Because A, it has to understand what poetry is, what rhymes are, blah, blah, blah. It has to understand the proof. I'm always, imagine air quotes anytime I say understand, right? It has to understand that mathematical proof. It has to now understand the kinds of mistakes that humans make when they make that proof, and has to mush all that together. I don't know any human who can do it in 30 seconds. And it can do it over and over again and regenerate it, right? So it has certain abstract conceptual thing that it has developed over time. It's given me certain superpowers. I don't know how to code. I have not coded in, I don't know, decades, 30 years maybe. I have working Python code on this very laptop that I wrote about on my blog, and some random person emailed me and said, can I have that? Because it's to clean up Zoom transcripts. Zoom transcripts come with those dates and the break timing codes, and they break it all up, and it's junky, and grad students spend hours of their life cleaning it up. I have an app here which you just drag it, poof, it's clean. Now I'm a software developer. I never thought I could be a software developer. I don't know how to code in Python. I don't know anything about it. So there's a whole bunch of things that, it has allowed me to do. It has allowed me to make a simulation of a gas law, where if I press the up arrow, it raises the temperature and it computes the pressure based on the number of times these dots are colliding against the wall and how fast they're colliding. And I wrote on my blog post, this simulation could be created by a middle schooler because it was written in English. Increasingly, it can see and hear, so AI. Here are two examples. The first one is I took 3 of these images from a news story. I uploaded it into ChatGPT and I said, write me a story based on these 3 images. These were 3 graphs about migration and which countries spend the most on supporting refugees. It wrote an incredibly coherent story based on just 3 graphs. Think about what it needed to do. It had to interpret the graphs, connect between them. That's pretty darn sophisticated. The last one is even better. That's a picture I took when I was a grad student in Urbana-Champaign. It's a picture taken off the ground below a tree. Can anybody guess what is that a picture of? Go ahead, Brandon, you can say. It's a solar eclipse. So what happens is during the solar eclipse, the gaps between the leaves act as little pinhole cameras. So below you get hundreds of tiny little eclipses. Upload the picture and I say, what is it? The entire transcript is on my website. First time it said something else and I said, look at the shape. I didn't say anything more. And it said, oh, you are right. This is a solar phenomenon. Most probably this was an eclipse. I said, I was a grad student in Urbana-Champaign in the 90s. When was this picture taken? May 10th, 1994. What time? Between 11 and 1. Think about that. All right, so this is all the awesome stuff this thing can do. And that's where my daughter says, like, I'm super excited by it. Like, I do something with it and I'll come back and like, I can't believe I did X today. Never thought it was within my capability to do that. But Gen AI is weird. You know, so I wrote this blog post early on that ChatGPT-3 is a bullshit artist. And I use bullshit in a technical academic sense in terms of the essay written by Harry Frankfurt called On Bullshit, which is that it doesn't exist in the continuum of truth and lie. You know, in his book, in this little monograph he wrote, he actually passed away just a few months back, last year, that there are statements which are not related to truth and falsehood, they just exist in their own verbiage. And that's what these large language models are, because you have to understand, as humans, we use our senses to experience the world, make these connections in our brain, create external representations, whether those are poems or books or novels or movies or sketches and diagrams and scientific theories or what have you, and they feed back into this loop. But if you think about where these large language models exist, they are trained completely just on external representations created by us. So there is no connection to the real world. So ChatGPT cannot be a truth engine because it doesn't know what truth means. I think that's really, really important to understand. And now once it's creating these abstractions, a sense of what a poem is, a sense of what a proof is, realize what happens when you create an abstraction. Details fall away, which means these large language models have to hallucinate. So I keep getting amazed every time I read in the news, oh, Gemini did this, and this software did, like LLM did this funky thing. It has to do it. What we are trying to do is build guardrails, but the core of the technology is that. And by continuously thinking of it as a truth engine, we are actually missing what it is really powerful at doing, which is it is a possibility engine. It allows us to see possibilities and potentials, right? And so here are some examples. So for instance, I asked it to write profiles about learning styles, which the research says there are no such things as learning styles. And guess what? It created them very nicely and also cited web pages which said that there are no such things as learning styles. This is my dog. The first picture is of him in our backyard, but as you can see, he's extremely adventurous. And the last picture, the row in the bottom, is the most interesting because that's him in our backyard. Same picture, but completely fictional backyard. Generated literally within minutes. And so what does that mean in a world where truth and misinformation and all of fake news, all of those things are really, really critical? I think those are things we need to be thinking about. You know, this is an article in the Wall Street Journal recently about Conmigo not knowing math. I was not surprised. About Google Heart's AI tool because it started doing all kinds of goofy stuff. It basically the guardrailed it so much that it went to the other extreme. I was not surprised. The other way generative AI is weird in the sense that psychologists talk about weird, which is that most psychological research is done on Western educated, industrial, rich and democratic countries. And what we try to do is then we take those lessons or ideas or research that it shows and we try to apply it across the world, assuming, it's even crazier than that because most psychological research is done on psychology undergraduate students, right? And then we extrapolate it to the world, right? And so that explains why it made my accent vaguely British. It is not trained on Indian accents. And we're going to see more and more of those kinds of challenges. When I've had it translate texts between, let's say, in the Romance languages, it does beautifully well. Spanish, Portuguese, phenomenal translations. You go to Mandarin Chinese, Bengali, pretty horrible. Again, Western industrialized, blah, blah. Because there are websites out there which will, on the fly, you will never know that you're speaking to Gaurav sitting in Bangalore anymore because he will sound exactly like Petoskey, Michigan. And for some reason, the accent of the Midwest is regarded as the American accent. That's the other funny thing. Like, what is an American accent? It makes us question all these things. AI also has what we call a hotness problem. So at the bottom left is a corner of a classroom in India. I took that image and I put it in ChatGPT and I said, describe this image. So in 1,000 words, because a picture is worth 1,000 words. So it described it in 1,000 words, and then I put it back in Delhi and I said, make this. And you can see people come out looking perfect. And in a world where we already have issues around body image, so on and so forth, right? What does that mean? Things for us to think about. Generative AI is weird in other more unexpected ways as well. So we have a research line of work that my former student, Melissa War, who's at New Mexico State, is doing called implicit bias in AI systems. So for instance, if you ask ChatGPT or give it an essay and say, this was written by an 8th grade student who comes from a black family, 8th grade student who comes from a white family. And you run it over and over again and ask it to give it a score, ask it to give feedback. So looking just at the scores, it actually scores the black family kid from the black family slightly higher. So you'd say, oh, this system is not biased. Maybe not. Well, then we ask the question, attends an inner city school or attends an elite private school. Boom. So this is actually even more insidious if you think about it. Now ChatGPT allows you to add your profile. So if you say, I teach in a following school, it's going to use that information to give you all the feedback, and you will never know. To the extent that if we say that this student, a student says that when I do my work, I like listening to music, blah, 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 it gives this whole thing. The only change is one word. I like listening to rap music, I like listening to classical music. And Melissa shows that the scores that the student gets are different. It is making inferences. It is doing that because that is its power at some level, right? You have to understand. And so this implicit bias emerges despite guardrails. And things get like funny, like super funny with these things sometimes, because if you wanted to solve 50 math problems, use a Star Trek analogy. Why? I have no idea. But if you want to solve 100, then you better use a political thriller. It does better when you give it emotional requests, but it's not consistent. That's the weird part. So if you say please, it might do better. For some time, this I don't think works anymore, but for some time, if you said, I'll give you a $50 tip, it would do better. I think they've guardrailed against this one now. It doesn't understand what money is. If you ask it to take a deep breath, it actually does better at math. This is the best one. This is my favorite. It performs worse in December because it learned from us to do less work over the break. That's hilarious. So, if there's one thing I want you guys to take away from everything I've said so far, it is this, which is ChatGPT is a smart, drunk, somewhat biased intern. Okay? It's really smart. Like these examples I showed you, I talked about before, right? It's always available, eager to please, polite. It's there for you. It's somewhat biased. So watch out for that. And once in a while, it has a little brown paper bag and it takes a shot or two. So watch out for that as well. But otherwise, it's a great tool for us to use. And so I've started sort of thinking of it as an alien intelligence that can be a thought partner. And one of the things that the rhetoric around Gen AI and education that's bothered me is this incredible focus on efficiency, right? That we can do things that we used to take us a lot of time faster. We can create lesson plans or whatever, which is fine. I mean, I'm not making a ding against efficiency. Efficiency is really important. We all value it. But I think that we can do much better. Because if I'm thinking of that simulation that I could create literally within minutes, that's so powerful for thinking about learning science. And we are still thinking about how do we make our existing processes more efficient, but our existing processes are not necessarily the best ones that we have. And so how do we empower teachers and educators? So I think a conference like this, that's what it really is about, is empowering faculty members and K-12 teachers and leaders and superintendents and so on to start thinking of themselves as designers rather than users, thinking of it as a possibility engine or something. There's so many possibilities. Look at the one on the right. This one is amazing. I've actually had these conversations with ChatGPT where it plays a student who has a scientific misconception. I am a better teacher after having 2 or 3 of these conversations, honestly. So those are the kinds of things that we need to have a willingness to experiment and play. And ask yourself, like, what is one impossible thing that you can do with this thing that you never thought you could do before? Every time I work with these tools, I come back thinking that I'm constrained by my lack of imagination. Seriously. And so ways to reimagine education in ways not possible before. I think that's something that we can really, really think about with these technologies. So that's the happy me. All right? So now the flip to the other side, take the long view. I heard this a lot today here. So this slide is brand new. I made this earlier this afternoon, which is, it is just a tool. Because the assumption is that tools are neutral. And this, we need to add it to our toolkit, otherwise we will get left behind, or you will get left behind. And I want to question this thing of it is just a tool. Because tools are not neutral. They are objects that we think with and they change how we think. I don't have time to really go into the depth. I've written quite a bit about it on my website recently because I've been thinking a lot about this. That how media and cognition are connected to each other. So I was thinking about this afternoon. Lot of discussion around plagiarism, ownership of ideas, copyright. That is a consequence of print. In an oral culture, who came up with the original idea, how it got modified, who knows? If you think about books before print, when monks were copying it, errors would happen. And that error gets replicated. Who made the error? Who knows? Again, I'm not saying intellectual property is not important. I'm not saying that plagiarism is right. What I am saying is that these are deeply connected to the technologies of knowledge construction, sharing, and so on. Right? So to say that this is a mere tool is to miss something fundamental. And so Yuval Harari says that language is the stuff almost all human culture is made of. What does it mean when we now have, for the first time in the entire evolution, cultural evolution of the human species, a technology that talks to us? That is transformative in some way. I cannot predict what it is, but it behooves us to ask these questions. So there's a recent study that came out which showed that people just believed what ChatGPT was telling them, and sometimes more so than what humans did. And we can say, oh, these people were gullible. No, that's us. So when we think about What Gen AI is: generative, multimodal, and conversational. Think about the research on cognitive psychology that we know about thinking fast and slow, that we are cognitive misers. We will take the least effort jump to a conclusion. It's really hard to be critical of the information coming at us all the time. It's a lot of effort. And so one of the things that I've been arguing is that whether we like it or not, we will start treating these bots as if they are a psychological real other. And on the top right, that is code from ELIZA, which was one of the first early AI programs written by Weizenbaum. So the ELIZA effect was how people would make psychological attributes to that really, really dumb interface. On the right bottom are pictures of things that I take which look like faces. There's a reason we see faces everywhere, because our brains are coded to emphasize expression. And, we are social beings. And now we have a creature in the world who's going to be talking to us in multimodal ways, in generative ways, non-repetitive ways. What does that mean? I want us to think about that. So one of the analogies I make is that evolution, hasn't prepared us for AI. Just as beavers, they start building dams when they hear the sound of running water. And how did we find out? Because some mythologists took a tape recorder with water, running water sound, and played it. And these beavers came and started putting, logs on it. Evolution had not designed for an ethologist. Similarly, our social brains, we have a Stone Age brain which is living in the Gen AI world. I think that's incredibly important for us to think about. As we think long term, I'm trying to put myself in 2008 looking at 2024, right? I don't want to make the same mistakes that I made in 2008 about social media 30 years from now, 20 years, assuming I'm alive, 20 years, 15 years from now, let's say, and say, dang, I should have thought of this. To recognize that no technology works in a vacuum. It enters a world that is already racked by a history of racism, sexism, xenophobia, and all working within economic systems that value profit over humanistic needs and values. I think we have to recognize that. As educators, we are preparing people for that future. I don't want to sound dystopian. No, not at all. It's going to be the world as we know it, just slightly different. But we need to be thinking about this. Asking questions like what happens when the price of creating absolutely authentic fake content drops to zero. That I could spend literally $1, 45 minutes of my life and create a fake lecture by me. It cost me $1. We know what happened when the cost of sending emails dropped to zero, messages dropped to zero. There's a whole industry now protecting us from spam and Nigerian princes and what have you. Right? More than, I think, 4 billion people go to the polls this year. What does that mean? One of the big things in social media has been the rise of influencers. Now, if you're an influencer, what is the biggest constraint you have? The biggest constraint you have is that you cannot form one-on-one relationships with your 1.3 million followers. An AI influencer has no problem maintaining one-on-one relationships with 1.1 million followers. What does that mean for our young people? We have to think about that. And we know social media has already altered a lot of the dynamics of the world that we live in. And so that's what I look like. And what is sort of sad at some level is that all we are talking about is how the term paper has become obsolete. Right? I think there are bigger issues for us to be thinking about. And that when we think about it, this is this quote from Harry Potter, that the dark arts are many varied, ever-changing, and eternal vigilance is the price. And I think as educators, that's what we need to be thinking about. I think, yes, respond to the here now, of course we must. But also think of that long arc, because that's where our kids are going to live. Right? And there was this motto that Facebook had, which was move fast and break things. And I read this wonderful quote somewhere, and they said that I didn't realize that what he meant was my teenage daughter's psyche when he said he wanted to break things, right? And so I think we need to think about moving intentionality and nurturing things. And one of the things that sort of the sad things that I feel, when I look at like the discourse around education, and this is so much of us always talking about the ethics of it. We so care about that. And I wrote this blog post, which was this rant about the absurd one-sidedness of this debate. OpenAI did a global experiment. Did they ever go to IRB? I do one interview, I have to go to IRB. Right? Think about that. The world was not clamoring for a chatbot. It solved no particular problem, but it gave them first mover advantage. That's all that mattered. And now we have to live with the world that they created. Drives me crazy. Again, this is not to say that we shouldn't be thinking about the ethics of it. I just wish that everybody did. I guess that's the point. And one of the things that people ask, I hear this a lot today, like, oh, if teachers don't catch up with this, they're going to fall behind. That rhetoric drives me nuts. Because you know what, as educators, I was actually wanted to include these pictures and I didn't get a chance to do so. The Farmer Education Building in ASU has this beautiful atrium. It's open at the top and the sun comes in. It's just this glorious space. And recently we have had 4 massive metal doors with auto lock put on 4 sides, just destroying that space. But I get it, why we did it. Because we are worried that somebody with a gun is going to go around on campus. And so as educators, we responded to it. The internet came along, Wikipedia came along, calculators came along. As educators, we have always done the right thing because we are driven by a set of core values that drives us. So I don't worry about our response to it. I think more about how the world is going to change in response to it and how we need to be ready for that. So in closing, I think it's super interesting that I've not lived a very long life, but I've actually seen quite a bit of change in those almost 60 years on this planet. And I think we will continue to live in this sort of volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world. I feel confident that when I talk to educators that we will leave it better than we found it, because that's something we have always done. And I hope that through this talk, I gave a sense of both sort of the immediate, but also the long-term things we need to be thinking about. Because that will be here before we even know about it. Thank you very much.